Here we are, Havoc! Don't be too excited. Nerfs everywhere. There have been some minimal unpruning going on with Immolation Aura, Demonic has been nerfed, and a few new talents made the spec more interesting in theory. So let's check out what your future main or alt will have in store for you. Or your ex-main, am I right? First, check out our stream at twitch.tv/MarcelianOnline where we actually trash Havoc. But really, we both love the fantasy of Havoc and secretly hope it can get some more death and high skill cap mechanics. No, really. And we do this 5 times per week at different times to catch you at least in one of the good days. But enough about that. Immolation Aura is baseline, but in a more gimped fashion, which actually sets the tone for the rest of the video. It now generates only 20 fury, but you don't pay a talent for it. So all in all, it's a step in the right direction here. Havoc is pretty bare bones anyway as far as specs go, so getting more stuff baseline works towards creating a more complete spec eventually. Still, has too little, still. Blade Dance has been nerfed tremendously. It no longer offers the 100% dodge while you are in its animation. This I don't particularly agree with. It's a strong effect to have and also a very iconic mechanic that involves skilled play in high-level PvE. This is also not unprecedented since the devs are reluctant to give classes abilities that negate mechanics such as, you know, the bullet mechanic from the Torghast's last boss. Ugh. Lastly, Blur has been nerfed to offer 20% damage reduction down from 35%, which is something that should have happened years ago. With a crazy amount of sustained baseline, passive magic damage reduction, a 1 minute cooldown with 35% damage reduction, and 50% dodge was way too much when you look at druids with bark skin that just gives a 25% flat damage reduction, period. The Kyrians of Bastion offer their Elysian Decree to Havoc. It's a 1 minute cooldown sigil that explodes for okay-ish damage in an AoE fashion and shatters up to 3 lesser soul fragments from enemies affected by it. In terms of numbers, it could change. Right now, it's a bit less than a full Immolate or about 2 Blade Dances. The main thing it does is generate massive amounts of fury if you pick the Demonic Appetite talent. Other than that, it's a bunch of healing on a mediocre AoE ability, at first glance anyway. Obviously, you would synergize it properly if you picked it. Its performance being tied to a talent is not necessarily a bad thing, but looking at it, it seems like a poor choice outside Demonic Appetite altogether. Father the Flame, the Necrolord's Covenant ability, is one of the coolest ones to get out, but maybe better for Vengeance than Havoc. It offers an attack speed increase and 10% damage reduction. The way it works is when you pop it, you summon a demon, a fairly weak demon, and when it dies, it leaves a large pool on the ground that offers those said buffs. The hidden strength of this is that by killing the demon and eating its soul fragment, you also get 20% damage increase. The demon can also be killed by your group, which gives you less control over where you position the puddle. On top of all of this, it retains its static mechanic weaknesses, where if the boss or trash pack gets moved out for some reason, you lose the benefits of it. I suppose that can be the skill of using it well. Illidan will finally teach you the hunt by joining the fairies and pixies and Bambis of Ardenwold. Ha! Fitting. A 3 minute cooldown, you mark a target for 1 minute, increasing fury generation by 50%, and activating the ability charges you to the target, dealing decent damage and rooting them for 3 seconds. Every 30 seconds, you can reactivate the ability to teleport behind them, ignoring line of sight. On paper, this sounds an incredibly fun ability, but in reality, you deal a bunch of damage every 3 minutes on a charge and root. Sure, this offers you ways to stick to the target, but you don't need that, do you? You are a demon hunter. And that goes double for most General Covenant abilities that offer needless extra mobility outside Kyrians with the debuff, cleansing and healing file, and Necrolords with their shield. In Revendreth, you will encounter the supposed best abilities so far. Relax. Tuning can and will happen. Sinful Brand marks the target for 8 seconds with a powerful debuff in the form of a dot and a 30% attack and cast speed reduction. This also applies to all targets hit by your Metamorphosis, and it's on a 1-minute cooldown, which is the thing that maybe makes this the strongest. Havoc doesn't really have any DPS cooldowns outside meta, which is on a pretty long timer anyway. Short, 1 minute or less abilities that offer burst damage are usually the best for any DPSer, and even more so for Havoc. Considering the Venthyr Soulbinds have some of the supposed strongest offensive bonuses, this could end up the best covenant for Havoc. Could? And even more nerfs. Oh dear viewer, I know, it's okay, you can cry now. Insatiable Hunger is actually not a nerf though. The talent now deals 20% more damage but generates 5 to 10 additional fury from the current flat 10. The damage buff to Demon's Bite is definitely welcome. It's on a pretty competitive row, though so remains to be seen if it will be baseline. Some proper logs will decide this in my opinion. Until then, Burning Hatred is the other talent on this row, with a change. Well, kinda. It makes Immolation Aura generate 60 additional fury over 6 seconds, bringing it to the BFA talent effect. This is maybe one of the more lazy on prunes. We lost the ability given by the talent by it being baseline, and what remained was part of the ability's power. I personally don't like the way they made Immolation baseline. It feels lazy. I can see they were focused hard on bringing down Havoc's overall power, which was never the issue people had with the spec, but this is another discussion of the devs cornering themselves with their design choices. More on this later. One talent that made its way from the Azrai world is Unbound Chaos. Outside the damage output it has, the effect is actually a fun one to use if its pros can outweigh the cons. After you activate Immolation Aura, your next Fell Rush causes your inner demon to slam into your target for some pretty hefty damage. The damage seems to split when hitting multiple targets. Also, the tooltip doesn't match the effect. The demon doesn't slam at the end of the Fell Rush, but at the beginning, meaning that you have to be next to the target or targets and Fell Rush through them. If you are further away, Fell Rushing into them will make your inner demon slam your initial position and not where you ended up. Not sure which effect is supposed to be correct, but the one that's actually present seems to be the ideal one, since you have more control over your starting position than your ending position. This takes you out of range of your targets, which is the downside, so the damage has to compensate for that. Also, this could work well with momentum if the damage of your inner demon is calculated after the momentum buff was applied, as the animation would indicate. The defensive row has been nerfed entirely. Soul Rending provides 5% upfront leech as opposed to the 10% we have now, and 25% in meta from the previous 10%. Overall in meta you will have 25% more leech, which is a buff from the previous 20%. The issue was outside of meta, and Havoc already had decent sustain paired with its cooldowns, but those cooldowns were also nerfed, and now we are looking at nerfs piled on top of nerfs. Desperate Instincts has had 5% of its bonus damage reduction shaved off. I mean, did anyone even play with this before? I suppose the nerf was to Blur as a mechanic, but Blur was, again, already separately nerfed. And this talent has seen, I think, 0 proper play outside people just picking it because they thought it was cool. Nerfing a talent that nobody picked because it buffed an ability that was also nerfed is a weird decision. Lastly, Netherwalk was taken to a 3-minute cooldown up from 20-minute previously. Personally, this sounds a bit right. Immunes are usually on a 3-minute cooldown for most if not all of the classes. Usually this change would have made the other two options more competitive, but they were already shot in the knee, so who the fuck knows anymore? If anything, Netherwalk is pure utility, while the others offer partial survivability, which needs math to factor in their value. Cycle of Hatred has been changed to reduce the cooldown of I-Beam as opposed to meta. With the demonic build, I-Beam gives you meta anyway, and the previous incarnation of this reducing the cooldown of a 5-minute ability was underwhelming to say the least, since the value of it came down to how many more metas it ended up giving, making it fall short of First Blood. With enough I-Beam steroids, this could see some play. First Blood has been making this entire row dead for years though. Same argument for Essence Break? I get confused with this ability since it has the same effect, same icon, slightly buffed and changed every expansion, still nobody uses it. Now, this is supposed to increase the damage of your Blade Dance on top of Chaos Strike. On paper, this could work with demonic windows for 6 to 8 seconds of decent burst, and overall seems to fit the design of Havoc. Since most of Blade Dance damage comes from First Blood and Chaos Strike from simply being your only proper spender, the buffs don't seem to add something Havoc wants or needs. Maybe change it to all damage dealt for 8 seconds, and nerf it down if it's too much in terms of its percentage. It's more boring, but flat damage increases are mostly boring regardless of the form they take. And lastly, Demonic. Its duration was taken down to 6 seconds from 8 seconds, meaning you won't be able to fit in 2 death sweeps during its uptime. That's a major loss, since this was played with First Blood and Trail of Ruin, both damage increases to death sweep, and really, that's where most of your demonic damage came from. There are 2 conflicting mechanics here. One would be the death sweep or blade dance argument, which was the only viable way to play Havoc for almost 2 full expansions. The other being talent as a system that should impose choice. Unless Demonic will synergize really well with Essence Break, for instance, or Momentum and Nemesis picking up speed, there's no other way to play this talent and feel good about it. And we are narrowing down on what the issues with Havoc seem to have been for years, but I'll leave those in the final impressions section. Next up, legendaries. Every class received 4 universal legendary powers and 4 spec specific. Ideally, we would like to showcase the spec specific ones, but in Havoc's place, the cooler and actually stronger ones are actually split. Keep in mind that the numbers will change and their strength will scale differently by the time you would get to play the full game. To save some time, let's look at some of the more impactful ones. Sigil of the Illidari is the universal one, which makes your I-Beam summon a Vengeance Demon Hunter that channels a Fell Devastation. This is simple, but feels really cool, like a proper legendary should. The only thing to mention here is positioning. The Summon Demon Hunter doesn't cast its beam at your target, but at where you are facing, and it spawns a little to your left. As such, proper positioning can influence the numbers of targets hit in AoE and subsequently your overall damage dealt. It's a nice skill-based thing to consider and reminds me of Momentum when you had to factor in hitboxes of your targets. Fell Bombardment is another cool effect and also available to both specs. Testing it initially didn't give me the proper feedback, but after a while the effect of this can easily be showcased to be pretty ridiculous and fun to use. When Immolation Aura hits an enemy, you get a stack of Fell Bombardment with a chance to occur, of course. This stacks to 5 times and each stack gives your Throglaive 20% more damage and a spawn of a second Throglaive to hit a nearby target. Each target hit contributes to your overall chance to get a stack, so clearly an AoE legendary. This reminds me of the Throglaive days of early Legion Havoc. Is this how my dad reminisces about his youth? Cool! More like this! Inner Demons is also the Legion artifact trait that seems to perform pretty well from what I understood. I mean, I used it, but the proc is so low and it's so hard to get an overall feel since details doesn't always track things properly. It was good in Legion, it's gonna be good in Shadowlands, no doubt. Erratic Fell Core is another legendary that's hard to grasp. It's clearly meant to be played with momentum, and however basic its effect is, this got me the most excited. The fact that momentum could make a comeback turned my choosing my main priority list on its head, and Havoc essentially climbed about 30 or so spots. Some of the other legendaries have very weak and uncontrollable proc chances. Chances to spawn a darkness when low HP, chances to give you Chaos Strike steroids in damage and Fury returns, chances to not incur an I-Beam cooldown. The effects are nice and randomness is cool if it's worth it. Players also like a degree of consistency and or control, so that needs to be balanced properly. Going into soulbinds, a short disclaimer. All soulbinds are universal for all classes and specs. Wowhead has a neat soulbind calculator that you can visit, so in the spirit of keeping the video informational and not turn it into a documentary, you'll get a quick showcase of the last supposedly most impactful trait each soulbind offers. Starting the expansion, you will have 3 soulbinds for each covenant, with some more promised in the future patches. The Kyrians have Pelagos, with combat meditation that increases your mastery by 5% for 20 seconds when you use their covenant ability. It also expels sorrowful memories, which you can walk through to extend the buff duration for 3 seconds. This is meh. At no point in its history did Havoc ever valued mastery, at least to the extent of sacrificing potential real damage gains. Valiant Strikes, though, gives you a stack of this buff when you or your allies crit. When reaching 40 stacks, you proc a heal over time for 10 seconds to allies nearby for 5% of their max HP. Considering crit is decent on Havoc, or at least used to be, this could turn into quite a support ability for your group. But since you are playing Havoc, that concept could be foreign for you, so instead, get Mechanicos with its bronze call to action. After using 120 spells and abilities, you summon Brawn, a big fat robot golem dude to smash enemies. Havoc is a decently fast-paced spec, even with loss of Furious Gaze, so uptime of this can be larger than others. Maldraxxus comes with Ultimate Form. This makes your Fleshcraft shield make you immune to CC, hardly useful in PvE scenarios. Any CC that's worth avoiding with an immunity is usually handled with Netherwalk, or through the sheer amount of stupid mobility this spec has. Runescribed Bone buffs you for each enemy defeated by increasing your magic damage reduction by 1% for 30 seconds, stacking. At 5 stacks, all other traits you selected are empowered to around double the effect. The magic damage reduction is okayish. You already have 10% baseline. The empowerment could be good though, since some of the traits increase your haste and sustain, but do seem to be more on the defensive side overall. Forgeborn Reveries comes from Hyrmir and allows you to fight after you die, dealing 50% less damage, and you cannot be healed. Lasts 10 seconds. This is situational. Could be good for progression and essentially gives you a larger window to be resurrected in if more raid members end up using it. Might be more valuable for tanks though. Moving to the Night Fae, Nia gives you Grove Invigoration, another mastery buff when you use your Covenant ability. This decays over 5 minutes and mastery is still meh. Maybe if it can stack with each the hunt use, it could be worth it. Pod Tender is a cheat death mechanic that puts a hot on you that heals you for 30% of your HP over 10 seconds. Max HP, of course. If you take 10k damage during that time, you die. The effect is fairly strong, but, and there are so many buts in this video, do you even need it? Havoc is mega mobile, has very strong defensives. These type of effects are what people usually want when tackling new content, since things are unpredictable then. That's a niche though. Is it for you then? Final Moments increases your damage and healing by 3% on targets below 35% HP. Not sure if this works with self-heal when you are under 35% HP, but the bonuses increase by 500% when an ally dies for 30 seconds with a 5-minute cooldown. There are a lot of death and dying themed mechanics which fit the expansion for sure, but do they fit the game? Skeptical. Lastly, we look at Venthyr and the Soulbind I mentioned earlier that could potentially be the best out there. Thrill Seeker seems to be the only real offensive trait at the end of either talent tree of any Soulbind. Being in combat and killing enemies gives you stacks of this buff. When reaching 40 stacks, the buff is consumed to speed you up by 20% for 10 seconds. Realistically, this will turn into attack speed increase since 20% haste pretty much guarantees Nadia, the Soulbind responsible, to be the only one picked by everyone. Attack speed increase could make Demon Blades very viable very early on. Draven comes with Call to Action that buffs you with 10% versatility and 4% to your allies for 10 seconds, when you use Sinful Brand of course. This also is a decent one, since versatility was always good for Havoc. Lastly, Theotar, which is currently still under construction, will give you a second charge to your Door of Shadows. Not really a big boost to a spec more mobile and that can get out of range quicker than my Tinder options. There are of course empty trade slots for Soulbinds, which will be socketed with conduits, the real power gains. Similar to legendary powers, these have some spec crossovers. There are endurance conduits that focus on defensive, such as reducing blur cooldown, finesse conduits oriented towards utility, mobility and such, and potency conduits, what you really will be after. Dancing with Fate gives your Blade Dance a chance to apply Essence Break, which we went over in the talent section. The problem here, because there's always a problem, isn't there, is that it's an RNG proc of a damage amplifier. Shares similar weakness to stuff like Vision of Perfection that procs at the end of mob's lifespan, so Demon's Touch makes Demon's Bite increase the damage of your other abilities by 3%. With the Nadia Soulbind and Demon Blade, you could have some interesting ways to buff your rotation, but outside of that is just a flat damage increase overall. Growing Inferno increases the damage Immolation Aura deals by 5% each tick, scaling. This essentially ties well into Immolation Aura builds, maybe Unbound Chaos or simply just good AoE damage throughput. And lastly, Serrated Glaive buffs the damage of your I-Beam by 8% on targets hit by Throw Glaive. I'm getting a Fell Bombardment, Cycle of Hatred feel about this one. And keep in mind that all of these numbers are presumably scalable with the data mined 15 ranks of conduits, so maybe we can see different builds for the spec later on. Can Havoc actually have choices? And that's actually a good segue into the final impressions. Havoc lost its stat scaling in Legion when Chaos Strike wasn't dependent on crit anymore to refund Fury. Fire Mage has Mastery, Elemental has crit, and pretty much most of the DPS specs scale with haste in one way or another better than Havoc. That doesn't mean haste is bad for you, but you did lose a huge chunk of it with the departure of the Azurite traits, and if you look at logs, Havoc is far from being at the top of the meters in BFA and is even remotely strong because the stupid amounts of haste it gets, and that lets corruption effects scale like a freaking truck, on top of everyone using a lot of versatile to simply give the spec flat damage increase. With the loss of all of that, things are grim in Shadowlands. I trashed Havoc for years, and that's not because it's an OP spec or the damage it deals is so much higher. It was never that. It was always the core design, at least after the first Legion iteration. The spec is fairly simple and hardly punished for making the wrong decision if you put it in the same context as Fire Mage or Survival Hunter. And the nerfs it got don't address the problem. It's easy to perform above average with Havoc and it doesn't feel as rewarding. Losing momentum gimped the depth of the spec, where now the hardest thing to do is make sure you maximize your GCDs and their uptime on your target, which is something everybody does. I love the spec since Legion pre-patch, and I get it's a mascot spec aimed at new players to have an easy, fun and flashy intro into the game. That wouldn't be an issue if there was a build a try-hard nerd can go for to feel satisfied for mastering and rewarded for playing it right, aka momentum, which personally was the thing that got me excited for Havoc for the first time in over 3 years. Although this is my personal opinion, I didn't get too much of a different vibe from people I've talked to. The amount of nerfs the spec had is incredibly discouraging, and I really hope they didn't nerf it so bad just so it can be propped up back by borrowed power systems from the expansion that will just go away in 10.0. Kip actually goes more in depth on this one in his Wowhead article, linked down below. Highly recommend giving it a read. And of course, in ending, thank you very much, dear patrons, for supporting our content. You actually make all of this extremely possible, give us the potential to upgrade our quality, and of course, starting our new podcast series, which you can check on our channel as well. And if you, dear viewer, are also interested in supporting us a little bit more, of course, it's not necessary or required, but it is highly appreciated. You can check our Patreon link down below. Some goodies in store. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.